Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have P'ng Loke, very interesting guy. Even at first glance, because he has an apostrophe in his name, which I think is pretty cool. He's a senior investigator at NIH, National Institutes of Health, and we're going to talk about how the microbiome is affected, how macrophages respond to, I guess, worm infections, Helminth infections. So, P'ng, thanks for coming.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, if you would, tell me about your work in your own words. I'm sure you could describe it better than I could.
Yeah, so I've been interested in how we respond to worm infections for a really long time. So worms are these parasitic worms that most of us are terrified about. But it turns out that they're really good at manipulating the immune response. And so ever since I was a PhD student, I've been studying these worms. And I've been studying how they affect a type of immune cell called the macrophage. And then more recently, I've become interested in this hygiene hypothesis, the hygiene hypothesis. So this is really the idea that, one of the reasons why we have a lot more autoimmunity and allergic and other types of inflammatory diseases in the developed world is because we've gotten rid of all kinds of infections, including these parasitic worm infections. And one of the things I'm interested in doing at the NIH is to see if you actually reintroduce these parasitic worms that people have been trying to get rid of to people that have these autoimmune inflammatory diseases, whether or not there would be some therapeutic benefit to that.
Okay, what would you reintroduce, and what would be the therapeutic benefit?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different types of parasitic worms. There is hookworm, there is whipworm, which is Trichuris trichura, and there's also another common intestinal worm called Ascaris. Now, a few years ago, basically what happened is I met this guy in California. And this was when I was a postdoc at UCSF. And this guy had deliberately infected himself with the whipworm, Trichuris trichura. And he did that because he had ulcerative colitis. So he had this inflammatory bowel disease, which was causing lots of damage to his colon. And basically, the doctors was looking at possibly having a colectomy, which is basically having the entire colon removed. And he had been following the research of an investigator in the University of Iowa called Joel Weinstock, who was doing clinical trials at the time to treat his IBD patients with the pig whipworm, Trichuris suis. And this guy decided he didn't want the pig whipworm, he wanted the actual human whipworm. And he infected himself deliberately with Trichuris trichura. And so when I met him, what was really amazing was that he put his disease into remission. And so I just became fascinated with this idea and the possibility that, these worms could have this potentially therapeutic benefit.
Well, why do they have this therapeutic benefit? What are they doing?
Yeah, so the worms are really good at manipulating their host immune response. These are pretty large multicellular organisms, and yet they can live within their hosts for years, up to decades. So what the worms have figured out is they figured out a way to mask themselves from the host immune response, to prevent themselves from being rejected by the host. So in some ways, the worms are almost like a successful organ transplant. So if you could understand how the worms are preventing themselves from being rejected and how they're manipulating the immune system, then that's kind of what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to do is trying to understand how the worms are manipulating the immune response in such a way as to downregulate the immune response or suppress the immune response so that they don't get rejected. And most scientists think there's a spillover effect essentially from having a lot of worms.
Well, I could see that they can hide from the immune system, okay, but how would they actually help someone with a condition like IBD, let's say?
Yeah, so you have to start to understand, why people develop IBD, and that's a big question. It's still not very well understood. But now, one of the leading ideas is that the people get IBD because they mount an inappropriate response against the bacteria that's in their gut, and so it's basically mounting a inappropriate response to the bacteria in the gut, and so the worms might be affecting that response to the gut bacteria. Having said that, there are clearly other things at work here, because there's also some studies indicating that worm infections can prevent allergies, and that's in a completely different tissue site. So there are hypotheses that the worms are inducing regulatory T cells. So these are T cells that can suppress the immune response in order to downregulate like an allergy or some other kind of inflammatory response.
Do you think they're taking up the capacity of the immune system of the host, and that's why it tamps down the response? Or is there some other mechanism at work that maybe because they're there, the immune system is trying to respond to them, therefore it's changing its immune response and it can't fight a battle on two fronts? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the worms are training the immune response. So like the hygiene hypothesis is very complicated, and I don't think worms is the only explanation for it. I think what's more likely is that when in the modern world we get exposed to a lot fewer infections than people that live in the developing world or wild animals, and it is only through repeated exposure to infections that we train our immune response to behave in the right way. So worms are something that during the course of human evolution, 70% of humans would be infected with worms. So we've really co-evolved with these worms, and so before the invention of the modern sewage system, almost everyone had worms, and so your immune system is kind of trained to tolerate these worms. And so what I think is that if you're not exposed to worms, your immune response is not as well trained, both to turn on but also to turn off at the right time.
Okay. So what's the guy that infected himself deliberately with the worm? You said his IBD like completely resolved, or like what happened with him? And did he do any testing on his blood or other parts of himself to see what happened?
Yeah, so exactly. So this was, this is more than 15 years ago now. So we've been working on this ever since. And we did exactly what you said, which is to, really carefully study the samples that we collected from his gut, for example. And one of the things we found was that when he had worm infection, his gut was able to produce more mucus. And so like in IBD patients, oftentimes the mucus layer is disrupted, and that causes bacteria in the gut to drive inflammation. And what we found in this person was that the worm infection was causing more mucus production, and we think that was what was restoring the barrier between the gut bacteria and the intestinal cells. So that's our hypothesis at the moment, at least, of the mechanism by which these worms could promote a therapeutic benefit for ulcerative colitis.
Oh, interesting. So, are you studying worm infections and how the human body responds, or how other hosts respond in terms of immunological response?
Exactly.
Or what's like the specific of your research?
Yeah. So exactly. So that's exactly what we're studying, is the immune response to these worms and how it could be beneficial to both the host and the parasite.
Well, what are you noticing? So you said in that one example with IBD, it looked like the worm is encouraging the proliferation of the mucus layer. What I don't know what else has been studied. Like, are you focusing in typically on, or specifically on how macrophages will? I mean, like, so what does the immune response look like when someone gets a worm infection? Does it look one way initially, and then it changes over time as the worm adapts and learns to fool the immune system?
So the kind of immune response you get to the worms is what's called a type 2 immune response. So this is the same response that gives people allergies. So when you have a lot of mucus, you can think of an allergic patient, someone with allergies having a lot of mucus. But this type 2 immune response, it turns out, is really important in also tissue repair and wound healing. So there are a lot of features of the immune response against the worms that we're interested in that are to do with this tissue repair and wound healing process. And that's a situation where macrophages play a really important role. So it turns out that macrophages that are induced by worms have a tissue repair phenotype. These are called M2 macrophages, or alternatively activated macrophages. And they seem to be very important in repairing tissue and resolving inflammation, which is different from macrophages that are important for killing bacteria. So you have like inflammatory macrophages that are important in killing cells, killing infections, but they also can cause a lot of collateral damage. And then you also have these macrophages that come in to repair the tissue and kind of clean up the debris afterwards. And we think that the worms induce more of these kind of tissue repair macrophages. So another aspect of our research that we're studying is we're really trying to understand how different people respond to worm infection. So I gave you a kind of a beautiful example of how it could be beneficial. But obviously, the worms are not always beneficial. They cause a lot of disease in some people. And so what we're trying to understand is why different people respond to worms in different ways. And we think that, this understanding this heterogeneity between people is a really important aspect of immunology.
So what are some of the different ways that it's been observed that people respond to worms? Are there major differences?
Yeah. So, what happens is that, in a place where worms are endemic, the majority of people, have worm infections. So this would be like, in Malaysia, for example, some of the rural villages where we've done our research, but also in Africa and South America and India. The majority of the people who are infected with worms are completely without symptoms. So they just carry worm infections and they don't have symptoms. But you have some people that have a very heavy worm infection, and then they develop pathology or they develop symptoms from having like really heavy worm infections. On the other hand, you have some people that mount an immune response against the worms that's too strong. And so they can clear the worms, they get rid of the worms, but they cause a lot of collateral damage. So both having too strong of an immune response against the worms can cause damage. But if you have a very weak immune response against worms, you can also get super infected and have very heavy worm burdens. And that will also give you symptoms. So what we're trying to understand is like, why do different people have different worm burdens, And we think that's important also to understand this concept of therapeutic benefit, because I don't think that worms are going to be beneficial for everybody. that has IBD. That what we need to do is identify the subset of patients, like the specific group of patients that would respond to worm treatment. And this would be a kind of much more targeted approach to treating patients with IBD.
Well, what is the approach? Is to let them have the worms, but keep the worm burden at a certain level. Don't let it exceed that. To deliberately infect them and then keep it to a certain level to try to get rid of the worms. I mean, what would be the modulations here?
Yeah, I think what we've been working on and what we've done some work in the past is I think we have to understand the underlying disease first. So what people realize is that, for inflammatory bowel disease patients, it's actually not like one disease. It's a lot of different diseases, So even there are two main types of inflammatory bowel disease. There's Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And even within each of those categories, like let's say ulcerative colitis, even within ulcerative colitis, there's probably a lot of different kinds of diseases that's being classified into the same pool. It's like cancer, like it used to be lung cancer, right? But then now we know that within lung cancer, there's all these different types of lung cancer. And I think the same thing is true in autoimmune diseases. So what we're trying to understand is like which particular type of ulcerative colitis patients are going to be the ones that might respond to worm infections. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How would you what kind of matrix would you set up to start looking, and what are the first signs that you would look for? There's a lot of variables, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. So it's become more and more of a computational problem. So what my lab is doing now is we're developing all these assays to all these different ways to measure the immune response. So what we're calling this like immune profiling, I guess, to really characterize the immune response of different people in a very detailed way. And then what we do is we use these machine learning algorithms to try and classify the immune response of different people into different kind of groups. And once you've determined the groups, then hopefully we can identify a specific group that would respond differently to different forms of treatment.
Well, respond differently how? I mean, what are the main set of possible responses, and are they all clear-cut, good or bad?
That's tough, right? We don't know that yet. I mean, that's one. That's why we're also trying to set up human challenge infections. So we're trying to set up experiments where we give healthy volunteers the worm infections and seeing how different types of people respond differently to the worms. So I can't predict right now, what is a good response and what is a bad response. But I think it's going to be like cancer immunotherapy, like when people are treated with these drugs to increase immune response against cancer. What you're getting is you're getting some people that respond to treatment and other people that don't respond to treatment, and that's a lot of work being done now to try and understand why some people respond to the cancer immunotherapy and not others. And so I think that with the worm infections, we probably go down that route also.
Amongst the different worms that can infect people, how much of a variation is there in? Do they all seem to have the same bag of tricks? Do they all seem to evade the immune system pretty well? Do some do it well? Do some not? What kind of variance do you see in the worms themselves once they've infected us? That would give you some clue as to how they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, no, there is a huge variety of different worms, and they all have different bags of tricks. There's some worms that live in the small intestine, like hookworm. There's some worms that live in the large intestine, like the whipworm. There's also flukes that live in the blood vessels. They all produce a wide range of different types of molecules. It's very hard to generalize, And I've been generalizing so far because, it's otherwise it gets too complicated.
Yeah, I mean, you can generalize, but there's, let me know any specifics that you'd like to bring up.
Yeah, so for example, what we found is like with Trichuris, the whipworm that lives in the large intestine, what we found is that it can alter the microbiota. It can alter the gut bacteria of its host. And we think that some of the effects are acting through the gut bacteria that's altered. So I think this is, I mentioned to you that it changes the mucus production.
Right.
And what we found was that this kind of mucus-rich environment was beneficial in promoting certain types of bacteria, and this led to that bacteria outcompeting kind of more inflammatory bacteria. But then, one of the things we thought initially was, maybe all types of worms can do that, because all types of worms induce type 2 immune responses that induce mucus production. But when we did an experiment to compare the different kinds of worms, we found that actually only the Trichuris whipworm causes these big changes in the microbiota. Like hookworm did not cause changes to the microbiota, and a fluke called Schistosoma mansoni also doesn't cause changes. It doesn't cause as large changes to the microbiota as whipworm does.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
These worms, don't they have their own microbiome associated with them, and then phages, and then viruses, and then I would think that they're essentially like a holobiont, so they would have their own levels of complexity associated with them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that is actually an area that's not been very well studied so far. But you're right. So like, Trichuris trichura has a microbiome of its own, and so do the others. And how does the worm microbiome, affect the host microbiome is something that we still haven't really looked into, and not many other people have.
Has anyone even tried to characterize the microbiome of these worms, and once it's in a host, how does it change?
Yeah, there have been some studies on that. And I believe the lab of Richard Francis in the University of Manchester has done some work looking at that. And I can't remember the specific details of it now. But yeah, people are beginning to look at that.
Okay.
But phages, for example, I don't know anyone who's looked at phages within the microbiota of these worms.
Well, if they have their own microbiome, then there's probably phage activity associated with those microbes that attach to them.
Yeah. No, and I don't think anyone's looked at that, which would be really interesting.
Well, if you don't look at the totality of their existence, then what's to tell you that you're not missing out on a critical interaction? What if it's not the worm itself that's really modulating the immunity of the host, but it's the microbiome of the worm? What if it's the phages that are bringing you some kind of beneficial plasmids to the microbes that attach to the Helminth, or if those phages are interacting with our own cells or our microbes?
I know it's absolutely. We there are that's a wonderful thing about biology and studying science and being a biologist, is there's always another layer of complexity that you can delve into. So for example, a few years ago, we didn't even really think about the microbiome that much. For example, when I first characterized this patient 15 years ago, the microbiome was not really such a big area of research at the time. So we didn't, for example, collect stool samples from this person. We didn't look at how his microbiome changed. So we certainly didn't characterize his phages, So it's like at every stage in my career, we've seen more and more complexity. And that's kind of one of the wonderful things about being in science is to look at all these things in more and more detail.
Yeah, I know you can't look at everything, but
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is the limiting factor, right? Like we can't look at everything, and we can already look at more things today than we ever could in the past, Like, for example, it's amazing with the COVID research, right? Like within a relatively short period of time, the amount of information we've collected on what happens during coronavirus infection is just astounding. And it's just because technology's improved so much. But, there's still a limit, we all have limits on our resources, and we always playing this game between trying to be focused and looking broadly enough to be able to answer a specific question and yet be open-minded to other possibilities.
So in regards to worms, what's your guess on the best place to look? Have you looked at the microbiome of people infected and that have different clinical outcomes for a signal there, or?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, so that's been one of the things we've looked at is the microbiome, and I mean, and clearly the genetics of the host play an effect. So, I think certainly the variation in immune responses that we're talking about is probably a combination of genetic and environmental factors, right? So and that's what we're interested in really understanding more. Like with the microbiome, I consider it part of the environmental component, and how that interacts with the host genetics is something that would obviously determine this variation in immune response that we're interested in. So yeah, I think I would classify the factors that would affect this immune variation into either genetic factors or environmental factors, and really kind of try and understand how those two things interact.
I guess the good thing is at least you could put a box around it, meaning that, certain worm infections tend to do, a limited range of things to the host. And, certain ones do coexist there for quite a long time, in perpetuity, I guess, until they kill the host or do something else, but they're able to evade immune function. So I guess, again, as an outer box, you could say that, all right, these certain effects are happening. We just don't know which components of the system is allowing it to happen or perpetuate. So maybe that helps.
Right. Exactly. And at the same time, we are getting more and more information about the different worms. So the genomes of all of these worms have been sequenced, and a lot of people are characterizing the molecules that the worms are producing. And that also brings a whole, lots of surprises sometimes. Turns out that some of these worms produce something called exosome, which are these like little packages of vesicles or of materials that can instruct the host's immune responses. So we used to think that the worms just secreted proteins that would change the host, but now we've learned that they make these vesicles that can be picked up by host cells and alter their function. So yeah, there's lots of things to learn about, each of these different individual worms.
Oh, so you've observed that the worms produce extracellular vesicles that go into host cells?
Yeah, we haven't done that work, so that's not work from our lab. But I'm aware of labs that study that. So like about in last December, I organized a keystone meeting on worms, basically Helminth. I guess that it was a Helminth keystone meeting, and that's where we got all the experts together and where they presented their research. And this particular aspect of work I found really fascinating. That the worms were actually secreting these vesicles that were full of, and some of it was microRNAs. It wasn't even just proteins within the vesicles. They had microRNAs within the vesicles that was altering immune function.
Did they have like specific cell type targets or what?
I don't know if they were, so that was the work that the teams were beginning to look at. It was, the specific targets of these microRNAs. And if I remember, the other interesting thing that came out of it is that, like these, what the researchers, and I believe that they were in Scotland. So what they were doing was they were actually using some of these extracellular vesicle proteins as vaccine targets. So the idea is that you vaccinate not against the worm, but you vaccinate against the molecules that the worms are producing to evade the immune response. So you're kind of disarming the ability of the worm to evade the immune system, and therefore allowing the host to get the upper hand. So that I thought was also a really cool idea, because no one's been able to develop, it's been very, very difficult to successfully develop vaccines against worms because they're so good at evading the immune system. So this idea of like developing vaccine against the worm evasion molecules, I thought was really cool.
It'd be really cool if, like, for organ transplants, that you said they're like little organ transplants. If you could take the the EVs produced by worms, or at least the components inside them, and use that to suppress someone's immune system, perhaps more naturally than these small molecule drugs, so they can tolerate a transplant, that might be really cool.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that was actually the reason I got so fascinated with worms in the first place. When I was a PhD student, my PhD supervisor, who's this guy called Rick Maisels in University of Edinburgh. So we were in University of Edinburgh at the time. He's now in the University of Glasgow. But basically, he got me hooked on the worms because he told me, look, if we can understand how the worms can evade the immune system and be like a successful organ transplant, you could use the same knowledge to enable people to successfully take an organ transplant, right? And you just learn all these cool ways that you could manipulate the immune response how do you tolerize basically the immune response to this foreign body?
Is there anyone that's looked at people that have cancer that also have been infected by worms, and what happens?
That I don't know any specific details. I think generally the idea is that it's bad for cancer because, in the case of cancer, you want to mount a good immune response against the cancer, and the worms might not be good for that. But that is really very general. I don't know any specifics, of specific, like really strong examples of what happens. There are certainly some worms that cause cancer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Wow. So there's a worm called Schistosoma hematobium that causes a lot of bladder inflammation. And that can lead to bladder cancer. And there's also a really fascinating fluke in Thailand I'm embarrassed, but the name has just evaded me. But this fluke can also cause cancer in people that get infected. So there are examples of the worms that can cause cancer.
Yeah, do the worms seem to exclude preferentially other organisms once they invade a host? Like if I'm infected with worm A, will worm B not be able to infect me? Like if you look at people, let's say in Africa, that are exposed to a lot of different potential worms and other parasites, do they tend to only have maybe one or two kind of parasites and the other ones are excluded because the first parasite gets there and says, yeah, hey, it's my territory now, get out?
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be the case right now. But that what you do get is you do get what's called concomitant immunity, where you get resistance to the same worm rather than to other worms. I think it's very, very common to find people with infections of multiple worms. So I don't think there's much kind of cross protection that like where the worms are trying to establish territory. But there is some experimental evidence that, if you already have a lot of Trichuris trichura, for example, you are less likely to get, infected to the same degree with more exposure.
Yeah, lots of questions. Last set of questions. Where do the worms come from before they infect a person? I know it depends on the worm, but what are some of the common intermediate hosts or places that they'll be found? And if you study them before they infect someone versus after, how much of a difference do you see? What kind of differences do you see? And is that informative?
Yeah, so the majority of people that are infected with worms get it from the soil. In fact, they're called soil-transmitted helminths. And this is from people being exposed to eggs or parasites in the soil. So hookworm, whipworm, and ascaris are the three most common worms worldwide, and people get infected when young kids ingest the soil. So, we know kids eat dirt, and basically, if they eat dirt that has a lot of worm eggs, they'll get infected. Or they, walk around bare feet in tropical climates, they can get hookworm larvae infect through their skin. So those are the most common ways of getting worm infections. The other very common way of getting worm infections are by the schistosome parasites, and that's from swimming in rivers and lakes and just being in the water. So there's, in that case, with schistosome the schistosome parasites, the intermediate hosts are snails. So the snails produce the sacchari, which are these torpedo-like worms that basically penetrate the skin to establish infection. So in all of these cases, the fecal route is the main kind of cause of transmission. So basically, in all parts of the world where you have a functional sewage system, you can effectively see a lot less worm transmission. So that's really the main places you're gonna get worms from are places that don't have toilets, basically. There are also some worms that you get from mosquitoes and so on, but those are more complex life cycles.
Well, I guess there's a whole world of things to know about worms. So, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and to get in contact?
I think they could look up my website. I guess I have a new NIH website now.
Okay.
I guess that's probably the best place to start, and they can read a bit about our work there, and I guess that's probably the best place to start.
Well, very good. Well, P'ng, it's been great to talk to you, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I hope that was interesting.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.